Hi everyone, I'm Angie Dick. I manage the Ventures BC, the PCIC Ventures BC competition. Welcome. Today we're doing a seminar on corporate structure, and we've got 3 speakers. We have Steven Saville, Pedlow, and Hardeep Gill. And I'm going to let them tell you how they're going to do things. I will just say Fasken is long time sponsor of the Ventures BC, probably like the best sponsor ever. They've been a gold sponsor for a long time, along with Ernst & Young and Saville and Ventures and the BC, or NVBC, formerly the BC Innovation Council, is our title sponsor. And then our silver sponsors are SFU, UBC Saturday School. Oh wait, SFU is my gold sponsor. I'm trying to go by memory, I'm failing. Alice Ventures, BC Tech Association, and CDRD. My guess is there'll be some latecomers. You guys are lucky. You're going to get 3 lawyers. And it's not too crowded. You can like pepper them with questions. We are also webcasting this online as well. So Rachel will ask questions if there are any that way.
For sure.
Do I have anything else to say, Rachel?
Oh, the ISI grant program.
Oh, yes. And in case you missed it, we are now administering a, it's called the Innovator Skills Initiative Grant Program. So basically, if you're a tech company hiring a tech or business student, you can apply for a grant. You put in up to $5,000. We put in up to $5,000. 50-50 match. So you can hire a student and get some. So if you don't want to know about that, there's a little start out to the registration panel. And happy to answer any questions about that as well. Otherwise, I will stop talking and I'll pass it over to you guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This sounds very loud.
It's a bit loud.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me okay without the microphone?
Yeah. Okay. I can see a volume. Is this one better?
Yes.
Great.
You're not recording this yet.
I'm broadcasting, but it's all good.
How about that? Is that better? How about now? Good? Too much? Is that okay? Yeah. Yeah?
Yeah.
Is it right? Okay, good. Because it's nothing not either not hearing or hearing echoes or hearing too much throughout the whole thing. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming. We've delivered this presentation. I've done it for a couple of years now, and it's one of those things where we pack it fairly dense with material, and we're trying to convey the general information, but also sort of convey some of the tricks of the trade, some of the things to think about. And I think sometimes we don't always know how far along people are. And what we're going to try to do is we've got a fair bit of content, and we're going to try to get through it as quickly as we can, because we want to everyone to have the benefit of seeing all the stuff. But we're going to try to leave room at the end so that we can deal with questions, either general questions or the I have a friend type questions. But we want to deliver the material, but we also want to sort of help people along if they've got any recent things to talk about. So we're happy to do that. Just sort of show hands. How many people here used a corporate lawyer before on things? Has anybody done that? So a couple of you have done that. Using lawyers in other contexts, I'll leave that one alone because I'm sure other than that, the corporate lawyer is probably the only one relevant for this this presentation. But as I said, we'll get through things as quickly as we can. Try to convey the info and be around for questions. So I'm Steven Saville, Geoff, Pedlow, Hardeep, Gill. I'll talk a little bit about Faskens, and then I'll let each of the guys talk a little bit about their practice. So Faskens, we're a full-service firm. We are the biggest law firm in Vancouver. We've got startup stuff, tax, securities, real estate, employment, litigation, you name it. It's a full-service firm in Vancouver. We've got offices in Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec City, London, Johannesburg. So a really big shop. We, for companies that are growing, it's really good. We think that we can deliver the service here and also support them in the other natural growth provinces and locations where they naturally grow to. I'm a securities lawyer, so I do public and private work. So when I started my career, I was doing all stock exchange work, all sort of initial listings, small cap and large cap stocks, and all of the IPOs and all the continued maintenance and future financings and that sort of thing. When I moved to Vancouver, I started doing private company stuff as well. So now I do a lot of private company work, both companies that are growing and start dealing with a lot of the shareholder series of financings, and also companies that that are just great operating businesses. They have 2 or 3 shareholders and they never need to raise capital because they're making money from operations. So the whole gamut really right now, and that's pretty much my practice. That's what Geoff described as.
Yeah, my name's Geoff. I'm the knowledge group here in Vancouver. There's about 15 of us that work primarily with early stage and emerging growth companies throughout the business life cycle. We also occasionally work with the investors that fund them. One sort of unique specialization in our group is we do a lot of very complex commercial IT transactions that you typically wouldn't see elsewhere. My practice focuses on venture capital financing and exits and M&A transactions.
My name is Hardeep. I'm a tax lawyer, so my practice is quite general. However, a lot of the issues that I deal with concern like smaller companies. I work closely with the group, and some of the issues are unique to smaller companies and.
All right, and I think one of the overarching themes we're hoping to convey, and it doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money at the outset, but there's a lot of problems you can save yourself down the line by getting a little advice at the beginning in terms of how to structure the company, what to do with employees, how to protect IP, how to make sure you get stock out to somebody you decide in the future you don't like, you've got a way to get it back. Lots of things like that can avoid the major headaches and major disputes that can prevent a good business from being a successful company. So that's what we're going to hope to convey. We'll talk about corporate structure and legal agreements. I'll just turn. Yeah, I'm not talking about anyone else is supposed to be. So we'll talk about corporate structure here. So most of what we do in startups is corporations. We'll talk about the various other ways to do it, but that is really the structure used for most organizations that are seeking to grow. It's a great way to raise capital. It's a great way to limit liability for people that want to put in money but not be involved in management. And it's a structure that all the investment community understands very well. So we'll be focusing on corporations, and that's that when you're in the investor community, that's what they're going to expect. Some people talk about limited partnerships sometimes. Those structures are typically used when any money that's generated in the company is being dispersed to the investors on an ongoing basis. But if you're going to be retaining the earnings of the company, to the extent there are earnings, the corporation is really the way to go. So that will be there to focus on. We'll talk a little bit about the legal agreements. There's a number of typical agreements you'll see, and we'll get into them in more detail. But when you're issuing shares, it's very, very handy to have some sort of shareholders agreement. When stock gets in the hands of people, again, whether it's an investor, if it's an employee that ends up quitting, you want to have share repurchase options. When you decide, 75% of the people want to sell to a third party, and there's one investor that doesn't want to sell, you need to have structures for drag them along into transactions. When you're talking, IP assignment agreements, when people are working for you and developing IP, they are actually creating their own rights to that IP. And if you don't have an agreement with them that assigns anything that they create to the company, you're going to have a lot of trouble when you both if they leave and take that IP with them, or if a seller or a buyer comes along and they'll say, well, who owns the IP here? What the company does? Well, what about all the IP the employees created? Did you get that assigned? No. Then you don't have the IP. So these sorts of things really important to document. If you have somebody on an employment agreement, you need to be able to get rid of them without too much hassle. If you have somebody on a consulting agreement, everybody likes to say they're a consultant. If they're not truly a consultant, and the CRA comes after them, guess what? If they can't pay the tax that they were supposed to, they'll come to the company to pay it for them. So you need to have indemnities and consulting agreements, things like that. You have employees, they want to have a lot of stock. It's kind of nice to have them earn it over time. One of the things we talk about, and we can talk about in more detail after, is reverse vesting agreements. This is, yes, we'll issue this stock, but if you don't keep performing for 2 or 3 or 4 years, whatever the period is, we get the right to repurchase it from you, at a penny or some nominal value when you leave. So that it's kind of like a stock option, but to get this into equity up front. Very important things. Non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality with the employees. Again, we're not. I think there's running the business. Often you don't need lawyers involved, but to build a good company where you've protected all this stuff, a bit of time and a bit of money at the outset can really insulate your structure and make it sort of bulletproof for the things that happen down the road when you're dealing with other people.
Learn those best practices that really do, so that when you are large and successful and there's real value, you already know what to do. As Steve mentioned, we're primarily talking about corporations today. But for context, thought we would provide a short overview of what the other options are. So these are listed here as proprietorships, partnerships, limited partnerships, type of partnership, joint venture, and then companies. So just briefly, a proprietorship, this is the simplest form of business. This is essentially one person performing all the functions personally. They're essentially self-employed. And as a result, all income or losses of the business are attributable and taxed at the rate applicable to the sole proprietor. So this has the benefit of very low startup costs. You don't really need to do a whole lot of it, and potentially you want to register a business name. There's potential tax advantages, as I mentioned, especially if you've got earnings elsewhere but losses in this business. But it carries with it, unlimited personal liability, which is, in a high-risk venture is not a good thing. You have very limited ability to raise capital. It's hard to incentivize any employees, anyone that's working for you. And you generally don't have limited access to government programs. Another option, as Steve mentioned, partnerships. Limited partnerships is a type of partnership. This is 2 or more individuals carrying on business with a common view to profit. One important thing to notice, this exists whether you mean for it to exist or not. You don't necessarily have to register a partnership. If you are 2 more people and you meet these qualifications of a partnership, you're a partnership. There's generally 2 kinds. I won't get into too much detail on that. The advantages of this are that you can distribute the risk and the duties. Relatively simple to set up. It has those similar floating tax advantages. But the downside is, again, risk of unlimited personal liability if you're a general partner or if you're a partner in a general partnership. There's joint and several liability for the actions of your other partners. And again, there's a very limited ability to raise capital. Joint venture we've mentioned on here. This is not really a type of entity. It's sort of a way to describe like a one-off project. It's 2 or more parties who join forces to carry out a specific project. Think of, for example, you're a consulting business, you might team up with a developer to create an app or a service that you 2 will share the operation of, but you each have your separate businesses outside of that. But just so you have some context context around what is a joint venture. And then corporation is, as we said, the most common form. Many technology businesses start their life as a sole proprietorship or partnership, whether they realize it or not. And then as it becomes clear that the business is viable, the founders then choose to incorporate. So Steve, I think we'll get into a little bit more detail around what that means and who are the actors involved. But just at a high level, so while it might be more complicated, potentially less advantageous from a tax perspective, the benefits generally outweigh those disadvantages, with limited liability for shareholders, flexible structures for control of the business, and very flexible structures for capital raising. Also access to government grants and programs generally are more often than not restricted to corporate entities. I've also mentioned on there just briefly, so a company can be incorporated provincially, it's a BC company, or Fasken, or you can potentially incorporate in another jurisdiction altogether. You might be familiar with like Delaware City Corp. So we'll be focusing on Canadian companies. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between provincial and federal.
And maybe just on that, absent unusual circumstances, I strongly believe a BC company is the way to go. It's got the most flexible corporate law, which as a director and owner you want. It's you have access to all the grant programs. If you're a Delaware company, you don't have access to tax credits and a lot of other things. And relative to the federal companies, there's no director residency requirements and stuff like that. So I absolutely, the unique facts could mitigate one way or the other, but the vast majority of the time, I truly believe the BC company is the way to go. So I'll talk a little bit about structure here. So there's a hierarchy, really. When we always draw them out, it's shareholders at the top of the line. As shareholder, you're basically you've got no liability. You put in money. Your rights are to elect the directors and anything you've bargained for in the shareholders agreement, and that's all you get. So it's the right to elect, and then I guess you have the right to ownership, distribution of assets and stuff like that. But in terms of directing the business, shareholders elect directors, right? And that's what you get. The directors are who controls the business, and they supervise the management. So as a director, if you just became a shareholder and you expect to have any influence, and you don't have enough shares to elect a director, and you don't have any rights you bargained for in the agreement, you're a passive investor and you're just hoping for the best. So that's what shareholders are. They get to elect the directors. Unless you have a majority of the votes, you don't get to elect anyone. So just think about that, and that's effectively how it works. Anybody can be a shareholder, can be a company, can be a partnership, can be an individual. You can issue shares to as many people as you want, thousands and thousands and thousands. It's a pain in the ass, so you want to have a manageable number of directors, a manageable number of shareholders where you're a small company, because there's things you'll need to do, and you'll need to, if you've got 3 shareholders and something needs shareholder approval, you can circulate a piece of paper and get shareholder approval really quickly. If you've got 1,000 shareholders, you've got to call a meeting. There's people will show up, people are going to come and debate and whatnot. You want to have a manageable number. And the other thing to know is once you go over 50, so 50 and less, for the most part, you're called what we call a private issuer, and that gives you access to certain exemptions for issuing stock, and it means you don't have to report your trades to the Securities Commission, which is a good thing. Once you're over 50 shareholders, you're not a public company, but you're no longer a private issuer. In every, in the main, with any capital raising you have to do at that point, you have to file reports with the Securities Commission. And there's not anything inherently wrong with that, but those are the ones that are on the Securities Commission radar as companies that are fundraising, and they're the ones that they'll knock on the door of and say, oh, we've heard you've been raising some money. We'd like to make sure you've done it correctly. Show us all your paperwork to make sure that everybody's appropriately has appropriate exemptions. So we normally, for the most part, if you can stay below 50 while you're growing, it's great. And you have to understand once you go over 50, you're taking a bit of a leap into a new realm. And once you've gone over 50 and you're no longer a private issuer, you can't get it back. Even if you come back under 50, once you've reached the threshold, you'll always be under the realm. So that's another thing to think about. So yeah, no liability. With shares, you can come up with any sort of rights you can imagine. Most of the good companies really you keep your capital structure as simple as possible. You have a class of common shares that all the initial people will be in. When you get into rounds with more sophisticated investors, they will likely ask for a specific preferred class with certain rights associated to it. You can cross that bridge when you come to it. But most companies getting into a complicated structure in the initial stages is not going to do you any favors. And when the real investors come along in the future, they're going to be frustrated by it and they'll want you to blow it all up and go put everybody back into commons anyway. So I think that's all I need to say on that one. So as I said, they elect directors. One thing, if you're a passive investor, we talked about shareholder agreements, and you can also put certain things into the articles. But if you're coming as a passive investor, preemptive rights is a very important thing. If they can issue you a chunk of shares at $25 a share, and the next day issue them to themselves at a cent a share, you're not going to be very happy. And there's nothing. You don't control the board as a shareholder. Normally, they have the directors. There's nothing to stop people from doing that. So what you'd normally do is you'll put in a preemptive right provision that says, now that I'm in, anytime you issue to anybody else, I have to have the right to participate and purchase my percentage share in the company at the same price you've issued the new shares. So that's when, if you're investing, don't miss out on that, because people can take your money and issue shares at lower prices in the future. And so, yeah, the relationships governed by shareholder agreements, subscription agreements, and articles. Geoff?
So we're going to talk a bit about sort of the different actors involved, shareholders being one of them, directors, as Steve mentioned, the shareholders elect the directors, and the directors in turn are tasked or responsible for the overall management and direction of the company. Typically, a director role is a part-time role. It's not something you do full-time. You might be the CEO, investor, full-time job, and you're also a director. So the director role, it might be quarterly, monthly, however often you think it need to, but it's not usually the hands-on aspect of the business, and I'll talk a little bit more about who is responsible for doing that. Some restrictions that you should be aware of. Electing directors, as Steve said, this is done by the shareholders. There are some mechanisms that permit the other directors to add new directors. You can fill a vacancy if someone leaves. Fill that, the board can fill that vacancy with a new director. Also, in certain circumstances, they can just add another individual. You have to have at least one director at all times. Commonly, you would want to have an odd number, whether it's 3 or 5. The reason for that is if you have an even number, 4, for example, and two directors want to do one thing and the other two don't agree with that, you're deadlocked, and there's not an easy way to resolve that. So the easiest way to resolve that is have an uneven number, and then you'll always have a tiebreaker. As Steve mentioned, there's no residency requirement for directors in BC, which can be pretty attractive to foreign companies that want to set up a Canadian subsidiary or a new business in Canada, or entrepreneurs in the States that just want to start their business here. All your directors can be non-residents. There are qualification requirements. You have to be at least 18 years old to be a director. You can't have been bankrupt or face certain criminal charges. So there's a prescribed list that generally aren't applicable to most people, but if you think you've got a shady past, you might want to be aware of that. So this says they have the power to manage the affairs of the company or delegate that responsibility. Sometimes the articles or shareholders agreement or other agreement will restrict those rights where shareholders have to approve certain things. They set the overall policy. One important thing is that directors all have what are called fiduciary duties and duties of care. That means they always have to act in the best interest of the company and its stakeholders. And they have to exercise the care and skill of a 10% or reasonably proven person or something like But anyway, you just have to be careful. So as a result, there is potential personal liability for the director. If you're breaching those duties, you can be personally liable for the breach. There's also certain statutes that impose personal liability, like if you're not paying your employees, or you're not remitting taxes to the government. And lastly, and this leads into the next point, is the directors appoint the officers. So it's usually the officers that are, running the day-to-day operations of the business. At the early stage, don't necessarily need to have officers, and usually the founders will pick a role that they want to fill. You might have a co-CEO or one who's CEO and COO. There's generally understood roles and responsibilities for each of those titles, but you can create an entirely new officer position if you want to. You can and literally call it if you want. As I said, they're in charge of the day-to-day operations. And in general, so the responsibilities, the authority that an officer has is delegated by the board. So the board determines when appointing an officer what they have the authority to do. And talking about, how we've gone through officers, typically at the startup stage, say there's 3 founders. The 3 founders will be the shareholders, the directors, and the officers. They'll wear all the hats. So lastly, the employees, the doers. I think this is, I'll pass it over to Steve.
Sure. So employees, I think we all sort of, they're the ones that are hired to do work. They got statutory entitlements. We've got an Employment Standards Act here that says when somebody's hired, there's overtime requirements, there's minimum wage requirements. Like you can't. If somebody's an employee, you can't pay them just in stock. You still have to pay the minimum wage. You've got to worry about hours and things like that. So, what I would, the overarching thing on this is there's a lot of detail in employment law that can be a real pain. It's, sometimes, I would say the law is generally very beneficial to employees. They sort of see them as the vulnerable person in the relationship and worthy of protection. So it's, if I was running a startup, I would say I would get a template employment agreement produced by a lawyer and use that on a go-forward basis. Employment law is different in every jurisdiction in Canada, to some degree. So finding one on the internet from Ontario doesn't work here. So that's something that's worth putting a little bit of time into just to make sure that you've dealt with it. Put things like probationary periods, agreeing in advance what the severance will be. If you have a co-founder with you that's an employee and you don't agree what the severance is, and you don't have a contract, there's we've got employment standards, but there's also common law, which is sort of overarching fairness considerations, and you have no idea what the court's going to say is the fair amount that the person should receive if they've been terminated. So, whereas if you put in an agreement, you can contract out of those. You can't contract out of employment standards, but you can contract out of what would otherwise be given under common law. So you could say, we agree that it'll be 2 weeks, severance or pay in lieu of notice for every year, for the first 2 years and 1 week thereafter, and at least you've underwritten your bottom line. If you don't have an agreement, you don't know what you're going to get. Let me jump ahead. Just too far. So yeah, again, confidentiality, assignment of IP, hugely important. If you haven't assigned the IP, give your employees the arguments that you don't actually own it. Non-competition, are they going to work with you and then walk across the street and work with somebody else and use everything they've just learned? Are they going to go after non-solicitation? Can they go after your customers? Now they know your customer list. Dealing with those things in a template employment agreement is worth putting some time and thought into, because it can save you a lot of grief down the road. And if you don't have an agreement, there's not much you can do to stop these things.
One thing I'll say about the non-compete in particular, in the context of getting advice, is get advice on that. It's important. Make sure you're getting advice on it because they're not always enforceable. So of course, notwithstanding that you contracted for something that restricts someone's ability to work for a competing company, that may not be enforceable against them. So it's an important term. Make sure you get advice on it.
Yeah, it's less is more for non-competition companies in particular. If you said you can't work anywhere in the world for the next 20 years in this field, like nobody's going to enforce that. But if you said 6 months or 12 months, and in the region where we're operating, you know, the expectation is you have an enforceable agreement. So Spence, anyway, don't let those issues go past you because it can create a real headache for you operating the business. Consultants, I talked about a little bit before. Lots of people like being consultants. There's a couple, a lot of people that are probably employees because they work there full time and that's their only job. Try to say they're consultants. I think companies often accommodate that because the person wants to do that for their own personal tax planning purposes. What you need to think about if you're willing to accommodate that is if the CRA reclassifies them and says, oh no, sorry, you're an employee. Did the company withhold all your EI remittances and all that other stuff? You need to put in the agreement that they're going to pay you back for anything that you didn't remit because you paid it to them. So do not miss that one in a consulting agreement. And same other issues applied. Confidentiality outside the 5P, non-solicit.
The one thing I'll say about IP in the consultant context is, at least in Canada, in general, while it's still really important to get the assignment of IP for employees, the default is typically that for an employment relationship, the employer is the owner of the work product, the intellectual property rights of the work product, whereas the default for the contractor owns the intellectual property. So a lot of companies we work with will not address that in an agreement where they hire somebody as an independent contractor to develop some software and later find out that that contractor owns that software and it can get quite messy, and it has gotten quite messy a number of times. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind when retaining anybody to do any work.
As Steve alluded, there's a number of issues from a tax perspective. So employees are taxed in a different manner than consultants are. Consultants are running their own business, consulting, and then employees are working for a business. And there's a distinction there. So if you retained a consultant, you should be sure that that is actually the role that they're fulfilling. If it turns out that they are employees later, then you were supposed to have been deducting for at source for each payment that you've made, as if they were an employee, and you didn't do that. Well, there are severe consequences for the company in failing to do that, and severe penalties that CRA will levy if that's not done. And similarly, CPP, and so you need to be clear that the relationship that you think you have with the worker is the one that's actually there in practice. The courts have looked at this particular issue very frequently. It's one of the most litigated. It's an area that CRA does audit quite frequently as well. And so what they look at is the actual relationship between the worker and the company to determine whether they're a consultant or an employee. And so they don't necessarily look first to the agreement between them. So it's good to have an agreement because that kind of that will give direction to how the different elements of the relationship are construed, but it's not determinative. And what the courts will look at is, well, who has control? Does the consultant have control over a business, or does the company have control over whatever the consultant is doing? If control is found to be in the company's hands, then generally you have an employee relationship, not a consulting relationship. Other important factors are something like tools. If the consultant is bringing, or if the worker is bringing his or her own tools, then that's more likely to be a consulting role than an employee's role. And so also consultants are supposed to be taking risks. They're running their own business, so therefore they have the risk of running that business. If it turns out that they're very secure because you're the only client they have and you have a long-term arrangement with them, well, that kind of looks like they don't have that much risk in that arrangement. They're being paid periodically and so on. So that's beginning to look more like an employee. And courts will not hesitate to find that is an employee relationship. So it's important to know what it is, like how you're working workers are related to.
You said if they are in control, what does the control mean?
So that's a complicated question. Generally, we're going to take questions at the end, but this one is quite related. So control has to do with like actual direction in performing the work. So for example, if the consultant is free to choose how to do the work, and basically like the only thing that the company's asked of that worker is that a certain goal has to be met, then the control would be in the worker's hands. If on the other hand, somebody's watching the worker do the work and commenting on like when they're not doing it quite the way it should be done and so on, then the control is in the company's hands. So there are a number of ways of compensating and incentivizing workers. So whether they're consultants or employees, usually employees. First is cash. So generally, you have to pay minimum wage in cash. And so despite anything else that you might give to your employees, some amount has to be like in currency. And so other popular ways, particularly for startups, are shares and options. Shares are generally subject to like reverse vesting, which means that, well, actually Steve defined that already. So a number of shares will be issued, then if like an employee is not around for very long, then the company will have the right to buy back a percentage of the shares depending on how long they've been. Options are subject usually to vesting, which is that well, more options will become available to the employee as they're there for a longer period of time. So there are different tax considerations for each of these. If the employee is basically just receiving a cash salary, well, that's going to be taxed as employment income. There's not a whole lot that you can do with that. There aren't that many deductions that you can take. So it is what it is. If the employee is also a shareholder, because, for example, they've received shares or they've received options and they've exercised those options and now have shares, then it's possible that dividends might be used. So often it's the case for startups that the director is the CEO, is the employee, the worker for the company. So they're going to remunerate themselves option dividends. And so generally between the corporate income tax and the dividend tax, the income tax levied on the person when they receive the dividends, there's not a huge difference between the two. That's called integration under the income tax act. But it may matter for other employees that are not under. So you can also, where cash is tight, it's like popular to use stock options or shares to pay employees. Well, because no money is actually being turned over, and so you don't actually have to have the money in order to pay the stock options or shares. And this is often valuable for the employee because they get a part of the business. Maybe they have a sense of what it's worth, and that would be enough for them. So stock options are useful to align incentives of the recipients with the venture. There's like extensive tax treatment restricted to just stock options. As I mentioned, employment income is very inflexible. There's not a whole lot you can do with it. It's taxed as income. You can't take any deductions from it, or very few anyways. But the key difference is that stock options that are received as employment income, like, they're not quite taxed the same way. They're taxed at capital gains rates, which generally means half the tax that otherwise would be payable, as long as the employee and the company follow like the guidelines set out in the tax act.
So when do you issue shares and when you issue stock options?
We'll talk about that later. Okay, so if your company is considered a Canadian-controlled private company, so basically it's not controlled by a public company and it's not controlled by a non-resident, then like, those companies receive the best stock option treatment for tax purposes. Generally, sorry. If your company is a Canadian-controlled private corporation, which it will be if it's not controlled by a non-resident person or by a public corporation, or any combination of both of those, then those companies will receive the best, or employees of those companies will receive the best tax treatment for the stock option issue. So generally, how it works is that when on issuance of the stock option or the share, as long as there's an agreement between the employee or and the company for that share to be issued or option to be issued, then there's no tax at the time that it's issued. There's also, if an option was issued, there's no tax at the time that the employee exercises the option. So at that time, the option goes away and the employee is left with the share. As long as the employee holds the option the share for 2 years. And then after the 2-year mark, the employee may choose to sell the share, at which point there would have been capital gains treatment anyways for the time that the employee held the share. But then you also get an offsetting deduction for the benefit that you would normally have to report on receipt of the option in the first place. And so like the whole thing is basically at capital gains rates, which is really advantageous in comparison to receiving the same amount of money as the share was worth in the end in 2 years or however much time it took for them to exercise themselves. If your company is not a CCPC, you can do something similar, but the tax results aren't quite the same. Basically, you do get capital gains rates, but then the company cannot just issue the share, like issue a share to an employee and expect to be able to fall into this treatment. Generally, like the option, if it's to be issued, has to be at fair market value at the time that it's issued, and that's like a big restriction. So that means that you can't just give your employee a share without getting anything in return, because that's not a fair market value. And so then they're going to miss out on the deduction, which kind of makes all this work.
Excuse me, when you say non-employees, do you mean consultants?
So non-CCPCs, but I'll talk about consultants in a second. So CCPCs and non-CCPCs can also issue options to consultants. And so consultants who receive options basically would have to record the value of the option into their income. So it's not employment income because they're actual consultants, and so that's business income for them. So the fair market value of an option is very difficult. Like often it's difficult to kind of figure out. So if the option is issued so that at the time that it was issued, like somebody would have to pay fair market value, like whatever the share was worth at that time to get it, then it's arguable that the option isn't worth very much. But then, 2 years down the road, it could be worth quite a lot. And so the consultant may not show very much income at the time that the option was received. And so that could be popular amongst consultants. There is like a small amount of risk because of the way that the Income Tax Act reads, in that like when the consultant exercises the option, it's possible that it could be considered a taxable event. I think the general view is it's not, but that's the issue. So the other common employee and consultant issue is that, like often this is the case with tech companies because it's easy for them to employ or to hire workers that are not resident in Canada, and so that can pose problems. Not just because of the Income Tax Act in Canada, but because of the income tax, whatever Income Tax Act applies to the jurisdiction in which the worker is. So if you have an employee and then the employee does work for you and the employee is located outside of Canada, then like I think in general that's an arrangement that should be avoided because that exposes the company itself to having a permanent establishment or an income earning arrangement in a jurisdiction other than Canada. And so then you're open to the tax laws of that jurisdiction, which even if you may not have tax owing there because you don't earn very much income there, is a problem because you still have to comply with whatever requirements that taxing authority has in terms of filings and compliance and all that. So there are other like arrangements where this this type of setup can be made efficient. So by having a subsidiary company, maybe do that employs the employee in that jurisdiction. Or like not having employees in jurisdictions other than Canada. So instead having consultants in those jurisdictions. Where a non-resident employee comes from a different country and then comes to Canada and does work for a company, then generally there are some tax issues there too. Like the company is supposed to withhold on any payments made to that employee as if that employee is Canadian. And so some companies may not do that, but they're supposed to. And CRA they'll probably find out of that, especially if there's been some sort of disclosure made to them. If there's a payment made to a non-resident contractor, then generally the Income Tax Act requires that the company withhold 15%. Generally, we're going to take questions at the end. Thanks. So 15% has to be withheld under Reg 105. And so sometimes that gets missed as well.
So one thing, just to reiterate that Hardeep said, because it comes up almost every day. It's talking to advisor, someone who's retained as a consultant with equity. It can be problematic. It's a lot easier, assuming you're a Canadian-controlled private corporation, if the person you want to give equity to is an employee. So if you retain somebody as a third party, even a web design agency to do some work for you and you want to give them equity, talk to your lawyer before you promise them anything, because it can be quite complicated for tax reasons, as you heard about, and securities reasons too that we'll hear about later. Just to round out the overview of stakeholders involved in the business, just want to mention briefly the advisory panel, advisory board, advisory council. One common misconception is this isn't a legal form. It's not like the board of directors, which has the statute deals with how board of directors, their rights, obligations, and liabilities. The advisory panel is just an informal grouping of consultants to the company, the people that you've retained or the company has retained to provide, they're industry experts. They're providing advice on specific matters. Typically, they're not paid anything, but they're given a small amount of options. And I'll talk to you later about what the normal range is, but usually, in the less than 0.5% kind of range. They might serve for a 2-year term, and you typically want to have a simple agreement that sets out what the company can do and what's expected of the advisor.
Right, thank you. I think so. Maybe we can just pass that. Oh, sorry. I'm going to move fairly quickly through these because I think we've talked about them, in the main. Just a word about conflict of interest. There's lots of different hats people wear in organizations. You've got a role as a director or as a shareholder or as as an employee.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Can you speak louder? It's a little difficult.
Okay. Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So just chatting briefly on conflicts of interest. Just people wear different hats in organizations. You have in your capacity as a shareholder, a director, as an employee. There's lots of avenues of potential abuse there, where you have you're employed in an agreement and you're the only director, but there's other shareholders, and you think that you could approve something that is beneficial to you that may not be a fair agreement or things like that. So anytime there's a potential for anybody to benefit themselves to the detriment of other people involved in the organization, it's something you have to think about very carefully. Certainly, it's on a board of directors, if you have an interest in an agreement, you are required under law to disclose it and make sure that other people that are included in the deal understand that you have a conflict and that you have an interest in the agreement. And just as a general matter, it's conflicts should be disclosed to the other people that have an interest in the organization. I think I've largely talked about this one, but just briefly, BC is a great jurisdiction for corporate law. It's a lot less complicated than dealing with offshore structures. There's a ton of tax benefits. There's employee option benefits. There's government grants. There's investor tax credits. There's no requirements as to residency of directors. So absent special circumstances, BC is a great way to go. Talked about this as well. Simple structure is good. Common shares, a very basic class of preferred shares is okay. Avoid issuing secured debt unless you have to. If you ever have a lender in the future and somebody else has got secured debt, nobody's going to lend you money if somebody else has got first place in security ahead of them. So be very careful granting security. And it's one thing to give it to the bank that has your operating line, but to give it to an investor, it's going to make it harder to get a bank operating line in the future. So don't give it away. It's something to be dealt with very carefully. And I think that's it for me on that one.
So tax considerations play a key role when you're trying to determine how to structure the share capital of the company. So a couple of different questions arise. So if you're trying to capitalize your company or you're trying to get somebody involved in the company, you can either issue shares or that person can have debt, so they can flow into the company. Secured debt might not work, but unsecured debt might work. It may be okay with the financier. So depending on the context, you may decide differently. So for example, if the person that's wanting to get involved in the business is not resident in Canada, then you may not want to issue that person shares, because we talked a bit about CCPCs. Then, depending on how many other non-residents you have involved in your company or who hold shares of your company, you may not be able to issue anymore without losing that status. And that status is worth something to you because there are a lot of tax advantages that go with it. And your decision may also be different based on the stage of the venture, and whether there are other tax exemptions that you might qualify for. Also, sometimes I believe Steve mentioned earlier, people who may want to invest in your company will have certain preferences. So they may ask that they don't get the same class of shares that other people already hold, and the reason for that might be that there are tax advantages to being able to hold shares that you fully paid for, and that others don't hold. So that's something to take into account as well. Generally, I think it's best to start with a very simple structure that you can easily adapt to something that fits whatever your needs are or whatever the needs of people who are getting involved with the business are. So I've already talked about the CCPC. So if the corporation has over 50% shares held by either a public corporation or another corporation that's controlled by a public corporation, or by a non-resident, or by somebody controlled by a non-resident, you're offside on the CCPC status. And being offside may not be an issue. For example, the company is quite large, it's all public anyways, so it's not a problem if it's not CCPC. But for most startups, I think it would be, because there are a number of tax advantages that go with CCPC status. The first one is that CCPCs qualify for the small business deduction, which is that they get this preferential corporate rate of tax on their first $500,000 of income. And in BC, that's federally, NVBC is 12% right now. And so if they don't qualify for that, then the general rate is 15% higher. So that's a big difference. So holders of shares in CCPCs also might qualify for the lifetime capital gains exemption. So if the CCPC meets a number of criteria, so for example, if there's an active business that it runs, the assets of the business are tied to that active business, so there isn't a lot of investments or other non-active assets that are sitting in the business, then When those shareholders go to sell their shares, if they've held them for 2 years, then they might qualify for this capital gains exemption, which is worth up to 840,000, I believe, right now, of like capital gains that go tax free. So in terms of like dollar forms, I think that's worth about $200,000 around there. So it's something that's worth it to each shareholder. CCPCs also get the preferential shred rate. So if you're doing scientific research or experimental development, which a lot of tech startups would be, then they get a better rate of shred credit. So I believe it's 10% higher than, or 15% higher than if they were not. And then their credits are in fact refundable. So the refundable credit is much better than non-refundable credit, because that means that if your startup is incurring all these expenses, which are shred expenses, but doesn't have any income because it's in the initial stages where it doesn't have a product that it's going to be able to sell, then if their credit is non-refundable, then they're not able to actually make use of it because they can't collect it from the government. The government doesn't not have to pay them if they don't have taxes that offset it. However, if the credit is refundable, that means that the government will have to pay them the amount that the credit is worth, whether or not the company has income to offset the credit. And of course, we already talked about the stock option benefits. And the disadvantage, of course, of CCPC status is that it may not work for everyone, because it could be that you're working with somebody who's integrally involved in business who is not Canadian. But in that case, it may be worth it to consider alternative structures so that you still retain it in some way. But it's definitely something to talk to a corporate lawyer or tax lawyer about.
All right, so just a little bit on founder shares. So this is sort of the first step you take in issuing equity in the company that's been newly incorporated. And typically what the founder group will do is allocate from a percentage perspective how much initially each of you own in the business. We typically recommend issuing a lot of shares initially. If you have 5 shares each, makes it difficult to go out and raise money because your share will probably be worth thousands of dollars a piece. So it's just easier and more flexible, and it's frankly arbitrary the number of shares you choose initially. As Steve mentioned, keep it simple. Just common shares for the founder group. There's no reason to get more complicated than that. Often companies or founders think they want to issue non-voting shares to somebody. I could spend half an hour explaining why that's not really necessary, but essentially, often those holders of non-voting shares have a right to vote anyway, so you're not really preventing any issues. What price should they be issued at? If you're each getting 1 million shares, you probably are only putting in a few dollars each. It's all sweat equity, so your issue price might be a small fraction of a cent. So you put in $10 each, and you've incorporated the company and issued your shares to yourselves. So who should get founder shares? It's the founder group. You might have someone you bring in right at the outset who's really just going to be an executive but not truly a founder. You might give them founder shares at the outset as well. But you wouldn't issue nominal price founder shares to outside investors. They would invest for this is where you set a price for the shares. You wouldn't typically issue them to employees initially either. We'd use the stock option route that we talked about a little bit, and again we'll talk about it a little bit more. A few mistakes that founders make when allocating their shares, as I mentioned, issuing too few. Typically, in the 5 to 10 million total range is what we recommend, and that way you don't ever have to worry about not having enough or having an awkward share price when you go to market. If you're worth $10 million when you do your first Series A round. With all the shares will be priced at $1 a share. It just makes things a lot easier. If you have 1,000 shares outstanding and you're worth $10 million, then your shares are worth $1,000 a piece, and then it gets quite a bit more complicated. You want to make sure you're setting aside enough in this initial cap table. And I'll talk later about actually allocating it to cap table, but setting aside enough for early contributors to the business and early employees. And then most importantly probably is reverse vesting. So as Steve mentioned, this is a right the company has to claw back shares from somebody that leaves. And this can be a bit contentious among the founder group. You might think, well, why do we need this? We're all on the same page. We're all founding this business together. I should own these million shares that I paid nothing for, and there shouldn't be any circumstance in which I have to give them back. And more often than not, 6 months, a year down the road, might not go quite like you think, or one founder has a change in their other circumstances in their life, and it's just a lot easier if expectations are set early, and that way you don't have to worry about negotiating it in the future. And you want to have the ability to, here's why it's most important for the company, is the ability to claw them back and give them to somebody else. If there's 4 founders, each at 25% of the company, one of them leaves, you might need to bring in somebody else with similar expertise and allocate those shares to them instead. So if you have someone leave and they keep their shares, you're going to dilute everybody by trying to issue more shares. So it's important, and we strongly encourage founders to do it. So the next thing I'll talk about, once you organize, set up your founder structure, determine a roadmap for financing. And this means determine what are the key milestones of the business that needs to reach, how much it's going to cost to reach each level, and how long it's going to take. Obviously, it's not an exact science, and help from advisors and peers and others will help you make this determination. But really, it's we need this much money today to reach that milestone, and that milestone will be worth in this range, and then we'll need this much money to reach the next. It's good to have that understanding, and it shows credibility when you go to raise money. And we'll use that we'll talk more about that later when I talk about the capitalization table. So how do you, what are some sources of financing? We talked a bit about government grants. Hardeep mentioned SHRED, that's good non-dilutive funding, fundable tax credits from the government. NRC IRAP, you may be familiar with that program. It's sort of salary matching for certain types of employees or other workers. Typically, all of these have eligibility requirements that you need to be aware of to make sure you fit into the right categories. And importantly, they also have ongoing obligations. You need to continue to do certain things in order to keep getting the grant or not have to pay it back. We heard from Andy just now, there's other options through ventures to do this. There's also what we call quasi-governmental organizations. So BDC Capital or BDC, you might have heard of. They provide debt to a lot of early stage businesses and founders, and sometimes this is convertible, so it might not be non-dilutive, but that's another route. Yeah, I won't really go into SHRED too much. Equity financing, where does that come from? Initially, founders might put up some capital. As I said, maybe they're putting $10 in each. Like, probably going to need some money from somewhere else then. Friends and family, it's common terminology for going out to your personal network and seeing if people want to put in a few $1,000s here and there. Maybe you need to raise a few $100,000 to reach that first milestone. And as you grow and show more value in the company and you need more money, you get progressively more sophisticated investors involved, angel investors and venture capitalists, potentially investment bankers for larger rounds of financing, underwriters typically in the public markets. Strategic partners as well, we're actually seeing that more and more. Large corporations in a similar industry are making venture capital-like investments in companies. Sometimes it's to get a competitive advantage or know a little bit about what they're doing, but often, nicely. So just to sort of break down the categories of financiers, as I said, founders can come in broader into money, often very little. Friends and family investments, 50 to 150,000. Angel investors, often it's in the $250,000 to $500,000 range. That may be a group of them, or one very wealthy angel, super angel perhaps. Venture capitalists, micro VC fund or early stage venture capital fund could be $1 to $3 million. Could be significantly more if it's a larger A round or B round or C round. Underwriters, I think just 1 to 5 could be quite a bit higher actually. And then strategic, again, it just depends on the circumstances. So I'll talk a little bit about the Eligible Business Corporation program. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's only in BC. If you're a BC company or a federal company registered in BC, you're eligible to apply. There's a lot of eligibility criteria you have to meet, or rather there's a number of different categories you have to fit into in order to be eligible to be an eligible business corporation. And the biggest draw is that BC resident or investors that are otherwise paying taxes in BC have the opportunity to get a 30% tax credit for their investment. So if someone puts in $10,000, they get $33,000 back from the government. So really, they're only putting $7,000 at risk, and $10,000 is going into the company. There's other eligibility criteria. Under 100 employees, at least 75% of the wages have to be paid in BC. 80% of the company's assets have to be in BC. And the biggest hurdle, or rather the biggest sort of hiccup that we often encounter where companies are trying to apply for this, is you need to have at least $25,000 of cash invested into the company for equity. That means founders need to put up at least $25,000, and that $25,000 doesn't get the tax credit. Maybe they have friends and family to put up $25,000 without the tax credit. That needs to be invested in the business for shares, and you can show the ministry that you've done that in order to qualify, in addition to meeting all the other criteria.
So generally, it's very hard to use, for example, your RSP funds in order to invest in a private corporation, except in the case where you have like a BCC or an eligible business corporation or the venture capital program. So that's one of the reasons why this is a really popular program, because people put their RSP money in without having to actually tax money to the product.
Yeah, exactly. You can end up, paying 30 cents on the dollar on your investment. Put in $10,000, invest in your RSP, you get the refund on your RSP contribution, you get the 30% back from the government, and you're off. So it can be quite attractive, and I would say the vast majority of companies that we work with at least see if they're eligible, because often at some point in your life cycle you're going to be raising money from people in BC. One important thing to note, in addition to the two biggest things to remember, you need to have at least $25,000 in at-risk capital. And if you sell within 5 years, or the investor wants to sell their shares or transfer them to somebody within 5 years, they have to pay the tax credit back. Some circumstances it can be reduced or prorated, but that's important to know that this is a long-term investment. You only get the tax credit if you're in it for the long term, or rather, the investor only gets the tax credit if you're in it for the long term. So that takes us to our break. I don't know if should we save all the questions to the end, or?
I would say, why don't we take a break? Anybody that has one-off questions, feel free to come out. We'll take a 5-minute break just so everyone can get a glass of water and refresh, and we'll be back for the 6 minutes. startups and all non-public companies is we deal in prospectus exceptions. And there's a number of them. And when we're dealing with the clients and they want to bring an investor in, or they want to bring in somebody that's receiving shares, somebody that's putting money in this, what exemption can we rely on? And we go through those. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the common ones that people use, so, and a little bit more detail. I listed here friends, family, business associates, credit investor, private issuer, the entity that puts in 150,000, crowdfunding, operating memorandum, employee, director, officer, consultant. Those are the typical ones that we see, and there's some traps and there's some things to know about each of them that we'll get into, but that's normally when we see somebody raising capital, they're trying to squeeze somebody into one of these exemptions. So let's, friends, family, business associates. So the idea of, certainly the point of view of the Securities Commission, because this is an exception I would say that they're not fond of, because this is an exception that gets abused a lot. The idea of a friend here is not sort of, we're friended on Facebook or that sort of thing. These are people that you can demonstrate a long relationship with, where they've gotten to know you enough to assess your trustworthiness, your different things. There are people that know where the bathroom is in your house. That is the view of the Securities Commission. So when when we have people that want to issue stock under that exemption, with the friend one, the family's pretty easy to prove, but the friend one, we have them put down in the certificate why they know the person, how long they've known them, what the extent of the connection is. Because, as we said, particularly when you're over 50 shareholders, you may be asked to prove that. And you do not want to issue securities without an appropriate securities exemption, because that's when you get on the radar of the commissions. You can be banned from being involved in companies in NVBC and that sort of thing. So very important. And family is spouses of founders, directors, officers, and that sort of thing. And friends is narrow, and business associates is narrow as well. It's we've got a history of business dealings together. We're not just people that have that I guess you've met at cocktail parties or things like that. These are people you've actually worked with, done transactions with, and in a way that you can attest to it if you were asked to. I think so. Yeah, no limit on number of purchasers or amount, subject to being aware that always going over 50 shareholders changes the rules. Basically dealt with this. You've known them for a long time. You can assess their trustworthiness. It's not somebody that you just I'm a social person. Everybody's my friend. That doesn't cut it. A credit investor. There is a very detailed definition of that in the Securities Act or in the policies. When we work with companies, we put that definition into the agreement, and people tick off which box that they qualify for. There's boxes ticked off for financial institutions, registered dealers. Those we don't probably see this ones as much, but the ones we see typically are people with $1 million of financial assets, people that have a net income of $200,000 a year, or together with their spouse $300,000 a year, or people have $5 million of net assets. So financial assets is liquid assets. Net assets includes your house and non-liquid assets. So when you're going out to accredited investors and you're doing it properly, you'll have a certificate. You'll give it to them. They will tick the box. And it's not just a matter of they tick the box is fine. And if you can't do this sort of stuff, be blind to the realities of the situation. These are people that in good faith, you have reason to believe that they meet these criteria. So this is a very common one when you're going out to serve third-party investors, the people that have money to put in. But you go out there and have them tick the box so that you can establish after the fact, as and when you may be required to, that look, we were duly diligent. We took the test to them. They have certified to us that they met this test. We had no reason to believe that they weren't telling us the truth, and that's why we issued the stock to them. Very common exception. Private issuer exception. This is sort of a subset of the other exemptions. It's while you have less than 50 shareholders, you can issue to directors, officers, employees,
family members, close personal friends, credit investors, current shareholders. So once somebody's been issued once, you don't have to go back to get them to recertify. But very common exemption, only available while you stay under 50 shareholders. So what is a private issuer? Less than 50 shareholders. You get to exclude employees, but it's sort of 50. You have restrictions of transferring your articles. Every private company we incorporate has that. But most law firms would be the same. It would say cannot transfer shares unless approved by board of directors, and has only issued securities to people on the previous slide. So if you've issued them to somebody that doesn't fall within these exceptions, you are no longer a private issuer as well. So that's those are the key aspects of it. Once you go past the 50 or you lose private status, you don't automatically go public. As I said, you're just no longer a private issuer. You can still rely on certain exemptions, but you're now required to file your reports of all your trades, most of the exemptions are required to report on with the Securities Commission. And as I said, it's at that point where you may get that letter that says, show us a list of everyone you've ever issued to and show us what documents they signed and confirm to us every prospectus exemption you provide on. And I've gotten 3 of those letters for clients, so it's not sort of this thing that can never happen. It does happen, and you want your ducks in a row going over there because you will, there's a reasonable chance you'll be required to establish to them that you have been complying with securities law from the date of your first issuance. There's the exemption for people that for $150,000. That only applies to non-individuals. So a corporation can rely on this exemption and put $150,000 in, and that is its own exception. That is not one of the private issuer exceptions. So if you use this one, you're no longer a private issuer. So just be aware of that. Council will always tell you this. Startup crowdfunding exemption. This is not a private issuer exception either. So use this one. You're no longer a private issuer. This is one. I understand sort of in today's day and age with social media and whatnot, it's a popular thing to talk about, and people like the idea of it. I would say think very, very carefully before you use this one. It's for one, you can't raise a lot of money from it. It's $1,500 per person, so you're taking it in small amounts. The size of your round is $250,000, so that's it's a lot of paperwork for not necessarily a lot of money. You're going to go over 50 shareholders, so you're sort of out of the other exemptions. And so, and I mentioned this before, like dealing with a lot of shareholders can be a real pain, right? You need something done quickly. You can go to the 5 people that, we need a shareholders resolution signed, you get it done quickly. So once you're like this, you're in the realm of dealing with all these people that have a say over the business. They can always go and complain. They can always say that, they're being treated unfairly as shareholders. And unless you've got a shareholder agreement with them, which normally never happens with crowdfunding, because you're just pushing the stock out, you can't ever get rid of them. A shareholder is a statutory right, basically. You've got rights. You can't deal with it. If you've got a small number of shareholders, you've got them on a shareholder agreement, you can say, you know what, you're in play. If you quit, we get a chance to rebuy your stock at fair market value. Or, 60% of the shareholders want to do this deal. We don't care that you 40% don't want to. Our agreement says you have to if we say this. But you get all these tiny shareholders out there, you'll never be able to corral them to do anything. So anyway, it's an option. It can be good for the right company in the right circumstances, but it's not one that I would recommend absent very specific reasons. Because maybe you're a marketing company and that's part of your market. Fine. If that's going to help you build your business, they're kind of they're shareholders, but they're users and they're members. That may work, but unless it's part of your business model to have a lot of people engaged sort of at that level, I would be hesitant to use that. Offer a memorandum exemption, almost never see it, but it's out there. It allows you produce a document that's sort of like
mini prospectus. It's got audited financial statements and description of the business. It allows you to go out and offer people that people basically use it if they can't find accredited investors. It allows you to go out to sort of more retail level investors with a document. They've got rescission rights. They have the right to sue if the document has misrepresentation. Most people avoid using it if they can get money from accredited investors, because that one you don't have to give them any document. They may ask to see something, but there's no offering document produced. There's no audited statement requirement, and it's a lot easier and more user friendly. But this is available if you can't find the accredited investors now to go more broadly, and you can't slide people under the other exceptions that I've talked about. You use this one, you lose the private issuer status as well. So in OMs, you've got to have a risk acknowledgement. They've got right to damages for misrep. They've got rescission rights. Again, you use it if you have to, but it's not my favorite practice. Directors, officers, employees. That's the exception. You can also issue to consultants. Most people don't blow right past this, but consultant is not actually part of the private issuer exception. I would say most people don't realize it and miss that one and consider themselves to be still a private issuer, but it's not. I've never heard of the Securities Commission taking an adverse view on that to say to somebody, oh, you should do it to a consultant. You're not a private issuer, but it's not in the definition. When you're issuing to consultants, there's a couple requirements for it. They have to provide sort of significant services, and it has to be pursuant to a written agreement. So that's one that it's there. There's a bit of risk around whether it pushes you out of the private issuer realm, and there's some technical aspects to hit the triggers of. That's it for me.
That point about consultants not being in the private issuer exemption is really important, because that comes up again probably daily. So talking about papering a deal, raising money, a couple of important bullets here: NDA, term sheet, and then the actual investment document, whether you're subscribing for shares, buying convertible debt, or a similar agreement. So NDA. It could be mutual or it could be one way. It depends, if you're getting information from the other party or not. Typically, you're only concerned about protecting your own information. One thing I'll say about the first point about an NDA is, in the financing context, particularly in the early stages, of course, there's exceptions where you might have a truly, there might be truly sensitive information that you'd be sharing right off the bat. But don't expect to sign an NDA with an early stage investor. Perhaps once they're further along and they're doing significant diligence, but that again often doesn't happen at the very early stages. And those VCs or professional investors won't sign one for a lot of reasons. Later on, the business is more mature and there's a lot more sensitive information, or perhaps you're truly a high-tech company where there's information that needs to be kept confidential under an NDA, then it becomes more relevant. So at that point, you need to think about what's included in there. So things like how long the information must be kept confidential, it could be perpetual, or you can set a time limit. Kind of depends on the nature of your industry. After a few years, often in the high-tech industry, confidential information isn't really worth anything anymore. It's stale. So the most important, I think, probably initial item is the term sheet. So this describes what the financing looks like. Maybe it's common shares, maybe it's preferred shares, if you're doing a seed, a large seed round or a proper Series A round. It could be units, which is just a means of describing a package of securities. Typically, that's a common share and what's called a warrant, so right to purchase another share, just like an option. It could be for convertible debt. It could be a SAFE, which is a simple agreement for future equity. If you're not familiar with that, it's a lot like convertible debt, except there's no obligation to repay. Other things the term sheet deals with: valuation of the company, if it's a price financing. Convertible debt and SAFE are typically non-price price instruments, so you wouldn't have the valuation, but you might have a valuation cap. So if you're issuing shares or units that include shares, whether they be common shares or preferred shares, you have a pre-money valuation and a post-money valuation. Pre-money valuation is $5 million, and you're raising $1 million, your post-money valuation is $6 million. It's fairly straightforward. You would describe your existing share capital on a non-diluted, partially diluted, or fully diluted basis. Often it's fully diluted. It takes into account other existing convertible securities, any outstanding options, things like that, not just how many shares you've issued so far. Term sheet would describe how the proceeds are going to be used. Default would be general working capital, but an investor might be providing funds for a specific purpose. You know, we're going to invest $1 million in your company so that you can build a new plant out in wherever. That's all you can use it for, and that'll be built into the documents. Big item is investors' rights. So in addition to buying, being a shareholder and having the statutory rights we talked about, what other rights are they getting? Do they get preemptive rights next time you want to issue shares? Do they have a right to sit on your board? Do they have a right to receive, as a shareholder, you get financial statements every year. Do they have a right to get monthly financials, quarterly financials, update from the CEO, notifications about other certain important things happening? Those are all really important. And generally, the farther along you get, the more money you're raising, the more complicated the financing is, and the more rights you'll expect to negotiate with these investors. Make sure drag along rights, like Steve talked about. Can you drag minority shareholders into a sale transaction, for example? Under the other category, one thing you might highlight is whether you are an EBC or you're CCPC, and if you qualify for RSP investments, things like that. That's, again, often more relevant at early stages. Later on, a VC firm probably doesn't care that you're EBC. So the actual paperwork for the transaction, once you got a term sheet, that's not it. Often, sometimes companies will sign a term sheet with an investor, think they're done, take their money, and go home, and they tell us they're closed, and we say, well, where's the paperwork? You need the actual investment documents. Term sheets are 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100 non-binding. So you'll have a subscription agreement that contains the terms, how much they're investing, how much they're getting. Company will make certain statements about its current status. If those are untrue, the investor can sue for damages. Investor will give certain representations about how they're a sophisticated investor. They know that they could probably lose all their money. They meet certain investment criteria, like Steve talked about, to be a prospectus exemption. There might be indemnification going back one way or another that, if this is untrue, we have to pay you for whatever damages result. As the company gets more mature, there's something called a disclosure process where you have to disclose against all of the statements that you make. So they really need to get into that right now. Convertible debt. This is like a promissory note that contains the terms of how much is being loaned, is there interest. Importantly, under what circumstance does it convert into equity? Typically, you do another financing, a price financing at, you raise at least $1 million, the note converts on the same terms. There might be a discount, there might be a lower price determined based on valuation cap. You need to determine whether or not the loan is repayable at the end of the term. Maybe it automatically converts. Maybe they can decide to just keep the loan outstanding. And as Steve talked about, you generally don't want it to be a secured loan, but sometimes investors need to see that. And so if it is secured, you also have a security agreement. If you have multiple lenders, you might have an agreement among the lenders as to whose security ranks senior. And importantly, convertible debt, you can't get the EBC tax credit for it. A safe, as I said, similar to debt, except there's no repayment obligation at the end. Someone invests their money, once the next financing happens, it converts. If you sell the company, they usually get their money back, or maybe they participate like the other equity holders. But there's no maturity date, there's no interest rate, there's no obligation to pay the money back if you never raise those funds in the future. It's at-risk capital. And similar to convertible debt, the biggest advantage is you don't have to settle on valuation immediately. If someone wants to put in some money, you can't agree, maybe you're worth $1 million, they think you're worth $1 million, you think you're worth 10. Use the safer convertible debt and let the next round of investors determine how much you're worth. Importantly, safes are eligible for EBC tax credits, but only when they convert. So if someone buys a safe today, they can't claim a tax credit, but when it ultimately converts into shares, they can. So that's an important difference. If you're an EBC, safe's going to be better. We talked a lot about stock options. I don't know that I really need to go into much detail here. It's essentially a right to buy a share of a company, and it's an easy way to incentivize employees and other contributors with upside. If your shares are worth $1 today, they have a right to buy a share at $1, and they help you grow the company, make it worth more, so that down the line they can sell that share for $5 and they earn $4 on each share. One important thing to think about is how many options you grant. You don't want to give away too much of the company through options. And also, what's the price? What's the exercise price? Often people think it should always be like 1 cent or some small amount. Generally, it should be whatever the market value of your shares are at that time. A good indicator is the price that you last in your financing. So someone asked sort of what's the normal allocation. Generally, you'll have an option pool. So you have 9 million shares issued to your founders. Maybe you have 1 million shares reserved for issuance under your option plan. That's 10% of the total 10 million. Of that 10%, this is roughly how you might break down allocations to contributors. Senior management would get the most. A variety of employees, maybe they get 1% each. Your board would, independent board members would get some. Generally, your founders, you're not issuing options to yourself as a founder on the board. You already got your founder shares. And board of advisors, again, they're usually the smallest. Maybe that's 0.5%. 0.5% would be high. So 0.1 to 0.5% would be fairly normal each. Maybe you have 5 of them up to 2.5%. And then keep some reserve because you're going to hire more people in the future or someone's going to leave. And you need to be able to grant more options without totally wiping out your cap table. An important thing here, like we talked about with reverse vesting, normal vesting with options. The standard is 4 years with a 1-year cliff, which means you don't earn any options for the first year. Once you've been with the company for a year, you get 25%. And then you get equal portions either monthly or quarterly until you're there for 4 years, and then you earn them all. Another important thing to know is if an employee leaves, a common term in an option plan is they only have a short window to exercise. Otherwise, even their vested options get clawed back. So usually 30 or 60 or 90 days. Sometimes they don't have the cash to put up for it, and that's too bad. So I just want to run through a quick sort of example cap table, evolution of a cap table, and then we'll get into questions. So you started the company, let's say there's 3 of you, you're going to issue 6 million shares, 2 million shares each, a fraction of a cent each, put up $200 each. That's all the money that you put into the company, and the founders control the whole pie. Your first round of friends and family financing, you need $100,000. You need $100,000. You think you're worth about $400,000, or you work backwards from these investors are only willing to do it if they can get at least a quarter of the company. That's how much you're worth. That means your shares are worth 25 cents each. They buy $400,000 shares at 25 cents each for $100,000 total. You'll see in the bottom right your founder's interest. Founders now collectively own just under 94% of the company, but that's now worth $1.5 million. Sorry, I didn't really talk about valuation there. So this round was based on a $1.5 million valuation plus $100,000 went in. $1.6 million once it's all done. That's how $1.5 million is how you get the 25-cent issue price.
Is that a typo at the top or is it $400,000?
Should be $100,000 for that way at $1.5 million. Yeah. At this point, you might adopt a stock option plan. Typically, you do it earlier, but for this example, you now reserve 1.5 million shares under your stock option plan. So your total issued shares is 6.4 million, 1.5 million stock options, 7.9 million total fully diluted basis is what we call it. And you still only raised $100,600. So this is $420,000 angel round. That is correct this time. The pre-money valuation, 2.24 million, plus 420 gets you post-money valuation of 2.66 million. 33 cents per share means you've issued 1.2 million shares to your angels. Adding that to your friends and family and your founder shares, you have 7.6 million shares. And you'll see in the bottom right, the founder's ownership interest has gone down, but the total value of their interest has gone up. And often people are confused about dilution. They say, oh, well, I have 95% of the company and now I only have 79. Well, that's fine because the actual value of that interest is quite a bit higher. It's a larger pie, you just have a smaller percentage of it. So you use a small Series A round, $1.5 million Series A. These are probably going to be preferred shares. You're now worth $4.8 million. At the amount that you've raised, post money 6.3. Founders' ownership interest is down to about 50%. That's fairly typical at this stage. You should expect to give up maybe 20-ish% of the company in each round. But that 2.1 million is now $3 million. And if you look here, your option plan of 1.5 million, typically a term of the A round financing is you might have to top up your option plan because the investors don't want you diluted by your option plan. That they want that option plan to dilute you. So they've got their 3 million shares, 10.6 million total, plus the 2 million option plan. Your total fully diluted share capital is 12.6. And then move on to your Series D, very similar. You're now worth 12.6 million. Things are going great. They put in $5 million. Look at your founder's equity. You're down to about a third of the company, but it's worth $6 million. So I'm not going to go into. I can talk a little bit about other. The one thing I guess I'll say about other agreements before we get into questions is, depending on the type of business that you are, let's say for example, you've got a SaaS business, it's more to have a standard template agreement for you and your clients. For example, a consulting agreement, template agreement that you can go with your customers with, and it's worth spending a little bit of time and money at the outset to get something that works and protects you, and make sure that when you do go to raise money and investors are poking around, they don't find out that you've accidentally sold all of your assets. Yeah, I won't discuss detail on that because there's probably some questions that we're running out of time, so we'll leave it there.
Yeah, we finished on time this time.
Yeah.
So I think what we're going to do right now, we'll put this up so you know who each of us is. We'll take questions from the floor, and I think there's some online questions, but we'll deal with all those, and I think we can all stick around for a while as well if anybody wants to just come up and ask questions after that. Where do we kick off?
Don't answer your question.
Okay, sure. I had like 3 questions.
Sure.
That's okay.
We forgot to answer your question.
Oh, that's okay. I'll ask it now again. That's okay. So the question was, the VC Venture Capital Program, does it matter if you are a CCPC versus a BCPC? And this is from Chimera.
So you're asking whether it would be eligible under the venture capital program if it was as a CCPC?
Yeah, if it makes any difference if you're CCPC or a
I don't think it does.
So I think I've heard public companies qualifying for UBC tax credits.
So that's a BC program, and so CCPC is like a federal concept, like an income tax concept, and so that's why companies that qualify for the UBC program don't necessarily have to be.
There's 2 separate criteria, so it's sort of like a Venn diagram. Some CCPCs will be eligible, some won't, and some non-CCPCs will be eligible, some won't. It's just different tests.
Okay. The next question is, upon incorporation, should a percentage of shares be set aside for funding rounds? What percentage is common? Or should corporations just depend on diluting shares as required when raising?
Yeah, so it's really the latter, and that's sort of I get a question like that often, and often, founders think, they think about their cap table and they think, okay, we set aside, maybe we set aside 15% for our option pool, we set aside 15% for investors. From a legal perspective, that's not really anything. I understand conceptually in your cap table, you might account for it, but when you're initially issuing shares, to keep things round, perhaps you issue 9 million shares to the founders, reserve 1 million shares in your option plan, and then when you go out to raise money, just expect to issue new shares out of treasury, and it'll have a dilutive effect on everyone from a percentage perspective. You don't ever really reserve shares or allocate them as a pool for investors.
Yeah, and we always recommend people incorporate a company with unlimited shares, and you can, hook yourself up into something where you've only allowed for 10,000 shares, and you really have to allocate them. It's good to have the flexibility to do what you have to do in the future. So always incorporate with an unlimited number of shares, and then you don't have to worry about reservation of shares.
There's reasons in the US why you might have a limited number of shares, but there's generally no good reason to have a limited number.
There's one last one, if that's okay, and then I'll let everyone else comment. So for our venture, one source of complexity is with co-founder equity, the level of contribution, and future salary, i.e. one co-founder might go down to part-time, but also wants a salary. So the question is, what structuring mechanisms can best handle these dynamics? It seems like salary should be less equity and uncertainty. What if they're full-time today, but might be part-time tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, there's no one answer for everybody. And one sort of rule of thumb way to determine, when you're trying to allocate equity among the founder group, one sort of rule of thumb is, if you were going to be working elsewhere, say this is your person that's going to be your sort of CTO role, what would they get paid at a different business if they were working there? How much are they going to get paid salary at the company? What's the delta? What's the value now? Sort of just allocate it that way. Typically, when it's just the early stage founders, there's an initial determination as to who's going to own how much of it, and that's all the equity that they're going to get over the first sort of 3 or 4 years. Potentially, once things mature, they'll compensate by way of options. If their circumstances change, that's always something that the founder group would negotiate. If they leave entirely, we sort of explain the reverse vesting concept where the shares are clawed back. If they just reduce their participation and role, that's typically something that you just need to deal with as and when. If they have to give back some equity, perhaps, or if they go from a part-time role and become more involved, there could be a bit of a realignment. But
I think it's always good to the extent possible to strike the bargain at the beginning and know what the expectations are, and make them pretty crystal clear. In a reverse vesting agreement can go a long ways to setting out, what the expectations are, what you need to do in order to continue to have the vest, and or what circumstances you trigger or repurchase option. It's always easier to deal with that when things are going great and everybody's excited and aligned at the beginning, rather than having to deal with it when somebody's not performing.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions at the group level?
I want to ask is like one small case. Is it possible, for example, convertible note issued within next 18 months, no round of investment, and 20 months later, the investor want to convert. Now the company wants valuation. Is it normal that the board sit down and come up with the valuation and ask the investor to convert with that price, or is there any legal procedure required, or what's usually the process?
Well, the notes that I typically do for these sorts of investments, they will have a maturity date, and they will have a trigger. And if that trigger, that financing that we've described in there, if you have not done that by maturity date, you owe me the money back. So if they haven't done that, I guess you can negotiate an alternative arrangement that may work with both parties, but that would be subject to negotiation at the time. And I think you sort of try to bargain something, but I don't know that there's any hard and fast rules in place, because you're effectively in breach of the agreement and looking for, they're not to apply the sword,
That's exactly right, and that does happen. You could reach maturity on your convertible debt. You haven't done the financing that you thought you were going to. Typically, the convertible debt has a term that has to be repaid, or the investor can give notice and demand repayment. But the investor still believes in the business and they don't necessarily want their money back. So you negotiate it just as Steve said. There's no formula. Maybe the note has a turnaround list, probably not. You're negotiating a new deal with the lender at that time.
Any other questions? We'll stick around for one more.
Just one quick question. It's assigning equity to consultants. So a person is a consultant in every single way. They have another job. They're not monitored. They use their own equipment, but they are a crucial key member who's required. So the option, what is the way to give them equity and options while they still stay a consultant? It's Canadian resident living in BC. Rest of it's all good, but the option part, is that possible, or how is that possible? What a couple of things.
There's both tax and securities laws issues with doing that. Unfortunately, there isn't like a simple answer. So it depends a lot on the circumstances. Tax issues might not be relevant because at the time they get involved, the company's not really worth a whole lot, and so they can probably get equity like they would a founder, but they're retained as a consultant. Or you could probably tell me if there's a huge issue with doing that, but that's somewhat common. And then, as Steve talked about with security, you have to meet a prospectus exemption. And one of those exemptions is a founder. So if you're truly a founder, that's fine. But otherwise, if you want to maintain your private issuer status, they'll have to fit into another category. So that's just something you'll have to assess with this person. So
hopefully you can make the argument that they're a close business associate, or and otherwise if you use the consulting exemption, you're technically out of the private issuer.
the short answer is there's tax and securities issues that you have to think about that you might not have to think about if they were an employee.
The tax issue would be that if you do give them that option and it's worth a lot of money, in the sense that your shares are worth a lot of money, but then the strike price is very low, then they would have to include the difference, at least the difference in their income, because the value of the option would be expected to be a bit greater than that, because if they exercise right away and sold a share, that would be what they would get.
So you recognize that right away rather than on exercise.
Yeah. So that's because they're getting something at that moment. The option is worth something at that moment, and they're consultants, so they don't get the benefit of the stock option treatment for employees. So on the other hand, if you give them an option that's at fair market value of the share at the time that you issue it, then it's arguable that the value of that option is not that high, because it depends on the future performance of the company and so on. And so they may not have to recognize such a large income inclusion at the time. And so that could be like an easy way of getting them in, as long as there are securities law issues.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to be around for a while, so I think we kick it back to you, but we're here if you have more questions.
All right. The question I know we're going to get is, will you share the slides with us for us to post?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll post them on our website, newventuresbc.com. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming on a sunny prime happy hour day. So thank you for those watching online. That's about it. Well, our award ceremony, the next big event we host is the New Ventures Award Ceremony, where we announce the winners of the competition, September 24th. So if you're on our newsletter, stay tuned, but it'll be kickoff for Startup Week. So have a good summer otherwise. Thank you.